The call came on a Tuesday evening in October, just as the amber light of sunset was painting my modest Tulsa apartment in shades of gold and shadow. I had been reviewing quarterly logistics reports for Driftline Construction, my laptop open on the kitchen table beside a stack of legal documents that had become the center of my universe and my sister's obsession. "Why don't we just talk this out over dinner like reasonable adults?" Gabriella's voice flowed through my phone with that particular saccharine quality I'd learned to recognize over 29 years of siblinghood. It was the vocal equivalent of perfectly ripened fruit with a rotten core, sweet on the surface, toxic beneath. I set down my coffee mug, the ceramic making a soft clink against the wooden table. Before me lay the documents that had transformed my life 6 months ago: probate papers, estate valuations, and the deed transfer that proved my father's house, sold for exactly $350,000, now belonged entirely to me. Every dollar, every cent, every legal claim to his life's work and sacrifice. These weren't just papers. They were the physical manifestation of 3 years of sacrifice, of countless sleepless nights monitoring medication schedules, of watching the strongest man I'd ever known slowly surrender to congestive heart failure while my sister lived her life 90 miles away in Oklahoma City, too busy to visit more than twice in 3 years. "I don't believe there's anything left to discuss, Gabriella," I replied, keeping my voice deliberately measured and professional. The same tone I used with difficult contractors who tried to renegotiate signed agreements. Dad's will was unambiguous. The probate court has closed the case. "Emily, please." Her voice shifted, adopting that wounded quality she'd perfected in childhood. The tone that had convinced our parents I was the difficult one, the unreasonable one, the sister who needed to be more understanding. "Just one dinner. I want to apologize properly for how I've been behaving these past few weeks." Weeks. As if 3 weeks of relentless harassment could be dismissed so casually. 3 weeks of text messages arriving at all hours. 3 weeks of voicemails from distant relatives she'd recruited to her cause. Second cousins who couldn't spell my name correctly. Great aunts who remembered me as the quiet one, all calling to tell me I should do the right thing and share the inheritance. "You're absolutely right," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she sensed my hesitation. "I've been pushy. I've been unreasonable. I've been a terrible sister, but I want to make it right. Let me buy you dinner. Let me show you I can be better." The words were crafted with surgical precision, hitting every note of contrition and sisterly affection. To someone who hadn't spent nearly 3 decades studying Gabriella's patterns, they might have sounded genuine, but I knew her tells. The slight uptick at the end of sentences when she was lying, the way she overused qualifiers when she was manipulating, the careful pauses designed to let guilt fill the silence. Gabriella didn't apologize. She repositioned. She didn't reflect on her behavior. She calculated new angles of approach. She didn't compromise. She maneuvered until she won. Yet despite every instinct screaming warnings in my mind, despite the alarm bells that had been ringing for weeks, I felt something I hadn't expected. Exhaustion. Not just physical tiredness, though the stress of her campaign had certainly affected my sleep. This was deeper, soul-deep weariness from constantly being on guard, from having to justify my father's final wishes to people who hadn't been there when it mattered. Maybe, I thought, one conversation would end it. Maybe facing her directly would finally make her understand that no amount of pressure would change the legal reality of the situation. "Fine," I heard myself saying, already questioning the decision. "One dinner, somewhere public." Perfect. The relief in her voice was immediate and telling. She'd been prepared for a longer negotiation. "How about rustic table? Downtown? Tomorrow evening at 7? I paused, my fingers drumming against the table as I considered the suggestion. Rustic table was upscale. Exposed brick walls, Edison bulb lighting, farm-to-table cuisine, with prices that made you blink twice. It wasn't Gabriella's usual choice for family meetings. She typically preferred chain restaurants where she could control the environment and the costs. This felt different, calculated. But it was also undeniably public, well lit, always busy. The kind of place where business deals were negotiated and important clients were impressed. From a safety perspective, it seemed reasonable. "Tomorrow at 7, I confirmed. "Rustic table." "Wonderful. I'll make the reservation. Thank you, Am. You won't regret this." She disconnected before I could respond, leaving me alone with the documents and a growing sense of unease. I picked up the will, the original signed document that had started this entire conflict. My father's signature was there at the bottom, witnessed and notarized, legally binding and morally clear. Thomas Mitchell Vance, operations manager at Stone Ridge Data Systems for 37 years, had left his entire estate to his younger daughter because she had been the one who cared for him when caring became a full-time job. The will's language was explicit. "To my daughter Emily, who sacrificed her career and personal life to ensure my final years were lived with dignity and comfort, I leave my entire estate, including my home, savings, and investments, with gratitude for her devotion and love." Gabriella's name appeared nowhere in the document. To understand the weight of that omission, you need to understand the architecture of our family's final years. When Dad received his diagnosis 3 years ago, congestive heart failure with a prognosis of gradual decline, I was living in Denver, working as a senior logistics coordinator for Mountain West Construction. I had a promising career trajectory, a comfortable apartment with mountain views, and a social life that included weekend hiking trips and occasional dates with men who appreciated my practical nature. I gave it all up. The decision wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was practical, the same way all my major life choices had been. Dad needed care that went beyond what visiting nurses could provide. He needed someone to manage his increasingly complex medication regimen, 12 different prescriptions taken at specific times throughout the day. He needed someone to drive him to cardiology appointments, to advocate for him when doctors spoke in medical jargon he couldn't follow, to ensure his dietary restrictions were maintained without making him feel like an invalid. He needed someone who loved him enough to watch him die slowly. I moved back to Tulsa in November, taking a significant pay cut to work for Driftline Construction, a smaller firm that offered less prestige but more flexibility. I moved into Dad's house, the same 3-bedroom ranch where I'd grown up, where the hallway still bore height marks from our childhood, where the kitchen walls were painted the same sunny yellow Mom had chosen 20 years earlier. Gabriella, meanwhile, continued her life in Oklahoma City. She worked in pharmaceutical sales for Morrison Pharmaceuticals, a position she'd held for 6 years and frequently described as demanding and high pressure. Her territory covered central Oklahoma, requiring travel that kept her busy 4 days a week. She lived in a trendy apartment complex near Bricktown, drove a leased BMW, and maintained an active social media presence documenting her professional success and social life. During Dad's first year of decline, she visited monthly. The visits followed a predictable pattern. She'd arrive late Saturday afternoon, stay for Sunday dinner, and leave early Monday morning with promises to return soon. She'd spend most of the visit on her phone, managing client calls and responding to emails. When Dad tried to engage her in conversation about his condition or his fears about the future, she'd deflect with cheerful platitudes about staying positive and not giving up. By the second year, as Dad's condition worsened and the reality of his prognosis became undeniable, her visits became quarterly. She'd cite work pressures, client emergencies, and conference obligations. She sent flowers for his birthday, a generic arrangement ordered online and delivered with a card that read, "Love, Gabriella," in printed script. During the final year, she visited twice. The first visit was Thanksgiving. She arrived 3 hours late, explaining that she'd had to stop by her boyfriend's family dinner first. She stayed for 4 hours, spending most of that time scrolling through her phone and complaining about the turkey being dry. When Dad asked her to help him to the bathroom, a request that required physical support and patience, she looked uncomfortable and suggested I handle it instead. The second visit was his birthday in March. She brought an expensive bottle of wine that Dad couldn't drink due to his medications, and a photo album of her recent vacation to Cancun. She left before dinner, claiming an early morning client meeting. Between those visits, I sent weekly updates via text message. Dad had a good day today. Cardiologist appointment went well. Bad night last night, but he's feeling better this morning. Her responses, when they came at all, were brief. Good to hear. Thanks for the update. Thinking of you both. I managed his care alone. I learned to read the signs of fluid retention that meant we needed to adjust his diuretic dosage. I became fluent in the language of medical insurance, fighting with customer service representatives who seemed determined to deny coverage for necessary treatments. I cooked low-sodium meals that met his dietary restrictions while still tasting like food rather than cardboard. I helped him shower when he became too weak to stand safely alone. I held his hand during the long nights when breathing became difficult and sleep seemed impossible. I watched my father, the man who had taught me to drive, who had walked me down the aisle at my college graduation, who had never missed a single school play or science fair, transform from a vital, independent person into someone who needed help with the most basic functions of daily life. And through it all, Gabriella lived her life as if nothing had changed. When Dad died on a gray Tuesday morning in April, I was holding his hand. He had been unconscious for 18 hours, his breathing shallow and irregular. The hospice nurse had warned me that the end was near. I called Gabriella at 6 a.m. to tell her she should come if she wanted to say goodbye. She arrived 4 hours later, just as the funeral home was preparing to transport his body. She cried loudly, dramatically, her sobs echoing through the house, where I had spent the previous 3 years learning to live with the sound of medical equipment and the smell of antiseptic. "I should have been here," she wailed, throwing herself across his still form. "I should have spent more time with him. I was just so busy with work, but I should have made time." I stood in the doorway, numb with exhaustion and grief, watching her perform sorrow for an audience of funeral directors and hospice workers who didn't know our family's history. They saw a grieving daughter overcome with regret. I saw a woman who had ignored dozens of opportunities to spend time with her father and was now claiming ownership of a relationship she had abandoned. The funeral was held 4 days later at Riverside Methodist, the church where our family had attended services sporadically throughout our childhood. Gabriella wore a designer black dress and carried a monogrammed handkerchief. She sat in the front pew, accepting condolences from family friends and distant relatives who remembered her as Thomas's older daughter, but couldn't recall the last time they'd seen her. I sat beside her, wearing a simple black suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and listened to people praise Dad's devotion to his family and his daughter's dedication to his care. No one mentioned that only one of his daughters had actually been present for that care. The will reading took place the following Tuesday in the offices of Henderson and Associates, the law firm Dad had used for estate planning. The conference room smelled of leather and old coffee, its walls lined with law books that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. Mr. Henderson, a thin man in his 70s who had known our family for 20 years, adjusted his glasses and began reading from the document Dad had signed 18 months earlier when his diagnosis was clear, but his mind was still sharp. I, Thomas Mitchell Vance, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament, he began in the formal cadence of legal language. The specifics were straightforward. Dad's house, valued at $280,000, would be sold with proceeds going to me. His savings account containing $47,000 would transfer to me. His retirement account worth $23,000 would be mine. His life insurance policy, with a $50,000 death benefit, listed me as the sole beneficiary. But it was the reasoning that made Gabriella's face go pale, then red, then cold. To my daughter Emily, Mr. Henderson continued, who sacrificed her career and personal life to provide care during my final illness, who managed my medical needs with competence and compassion, and who ensured that my final years were lived with dignity. I leave my entire estate. Her devotion to my welfare during my time of greatest need has earned my gratitude and this expression of my love. The silence in the room was profound. Gabriella stared at the document as if she could change its contents through sheer force of will. "There must be some mistake," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid not," Mr. Henderson replied gently. "Your father was very clear about his wishes. He updated this will 18 months ago, well before his condition affected his mental capacity. He specifically requested that I explain his reasoning to both of you." "But I'm his daughter, too," Gabriella protested, her voice gaining strength. "He can't just leave everything to Emily. That's not fair." "Your father felt that Emily's sacrifice during his final years warranted this decision," Mr. Henderson explained. He was grateful for her care and wanted to ensure she was compensated for the career opportunities she gave up to be with him. Gabriella's hands clenched into fists on the conference table. She manipulated him. She isolated him from the rest of the family. She made him think I didn't care. "Mrs. Patterson," Mr. Henderson said, using her married name, though she'd been divorced for 2 years, "your father's mental capacity was assessed by his physician before he signed this document. He was fully competent to make these decisions. The will is legally binding and has been filed with the probate court." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over," she said, looking directly at me for the first time since the reading began. "This isn't fair, and it isn't over." She walked out without another word, leaving me alone with Mr. Henderson and the weight of my father's final gift. The first call came 2 days after the will reading. "Emily, we need to talk," Gabriella said without preamble when I answered my phone. "This whole situation is ridiculous. Dad was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. You took advantage of him." "The lawyer explained that Dad was mentally competent when he signed the will," I replied, setting down the box of Dad's belongings I'd been sorting through. His doctor confirmed it. "Doctors can be wrong, lawyers can be bought. You spent 3 years poisoning his mind against me." "I spent 3 years taking care of him while you lived your life. I was working. I had responsibilities. I couldn't just drop everything and play nursemaid." The word nursemaid hit like a slap, as if caring for our dying father was some kind of menial task rather than an act of love. "I had responsibilities too," I said quietly. "I had a career. I had a life. I gave it up because someone needed to be there for him. And now you're being rewarded for it while I get nothing. That's not how families work, Emily." "It's exactly how this family works," I said. "It's how it's always worked. The person who shows up gets the benefits. The person who doesn't show up gets the consequences." She hung up. The calls continued daily for the first week, then the text messages started. Long, rambling accusations sent at all hours of the night. Screenshots of old family photos with captions about how, "We used to be a loving family before Emily turned Dad against me." Posts on social media about betrayal and greed, carefully worded to avoid naming me directly, but clear enough that anyone who knew our situation would understand the target. By the second week, she had recruited reinforcements. My phone rang at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. The caller ID showed Aunt Beverly, Dad's sister, whom I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. "Emily, honey, I heard about the situation with your father's will," she began in the syrupy tone people use when they're about to ask for something they have no right to request. "Gabriella is just devastated. She feels like you've stolen her inheritance." "I haven't stolen anything," I said, pouring coffee with shaking hands. "I inherited what Dad chose to leave me. But surely you can see how unfair this looks. She's his daughter, too. Don't you think you should share?" "Aunt Beverly, when was the last time you visited Dad?" Silence. "When was the last time you called him? Sent him a card? Asked about his condition?" More silence. I thought so. Gabriella has been calling family members who didn't care enough to visit a dying man, asking them to pressure me into giving her money. If you think that's appropriate, then we have different definitions of family loyalty. I hung up and immediately blocked her number. The calls from relatives continued throughout the third week. Second cousins I barely remembered. Great aunts who confused me with my mother. Family friends who had heard Gabriella's side of the story and felt compelled to share their opinions about fairness and forgiveness. Each call followed the same pattern: expressions of sympathy for my loss, acknowledgement that I had been a devoted caregiver, followed by gentle suggestions that the right thing to do would be to share the inheritance with my sister. When I explained that Dad had made his wishes clear, they would pivot to discussions about family harmony and Christian forgiveness. None of them had visited Dad during his illness. None of them had called to check on him. None of them had offered to help with his care or even asked what they could do to support him during his final years. But all of them had opinions about how his money should be distributed. By the end of the third week, I was exhausted, not just from the constant pressure, but from the realization that my extended family's concern for Dad's welfare had materialized only after his death, and only in the context of money. That's when Gabriella called with her dinner invitation. Rustic table occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in downtown Tulsa's Arts District. The interior designer had embraced the industrial aesthetic: exposed brick walls, steel beams painted matte black, Edison bulbs suspended from the ceiling in geometric arrangements. The tables were crafted from reclaimed wood, each one bearing the scars and character marks of its previous life. The overall effect was sophisticated yet approachable, the kind of place where business deals were negotiated over craft cocktails and locally sourced entrees. I arrived at 6:55 p.m., 5 minutes early as was my professional habit. In the construction industry, punctuality wasn't just courtesy. It was a sign of competence and reliability. Contractors who showed up late lost bids. Suppliers who missed delivery windows lost contracts. I had built my career on the foundation of showing up when I said I would. I wore a navy blue dress that struck the right balance between professional and personal. Appropriate for a family dinner, but tailored enough to command respect. I had chosen my outfit carefully, understanding that clothing could be armor in difficult conversations. I wanted to look like someone who took the meeting seriously, but wasn't trying to impress or intimidate. The hostess, a young woman with purple hair and multiple ear piercings, led me to a corner table where Gabriella was already seated. My sister looked immaculate, as she always did. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, each strand precisely placed. Her makeup was flawless, foundation that matched her skin tone exactly, eyeshadow that enhanced her blue eyes, lipstick that was bold enough to make a statement, but professional enough for a business dinner. She wore a cream-colored blouse that I recognized from a fashion magazine and jewelry that caught the light as she moved. Everything about her appearance was calculated to project success, confidence, and control. When she saw me approaching, her smile bloomed like a flower opening to sunlight, wide, warm, and completely artificial. "Emily," she exclaimed, rising from her chair with arms outstretched. "You came. I wasn't sure you would actually show up." She enveloped me in a hug that felt performative rather than genuine, the kind of embrace politicians share for cameras. Her perfume was expensive and overwhelming, a floral scent that seemed designed to announce her presence from across a room. "You invited me," I said simply, extricating myself from her grip and sliding into the chair across from her. "I said I would be here." "I know, but after everything that's happened, I wouldn't have blamed you for changing your mind." She settled back into her seat, her movements graceful and deliberate. "I'm just so glad we're doing this. Really, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I realize I haven't been fair to you." A server appeared at our table, a young man with a carefully groomed beard and the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he was either new to the job or genuinely loved talking about food. Good evening, ladies. Welcome to Rustic Table. Can I start you off with something to drink? Gabriella had already ordered a bottle of wine, a Cabernet Sauvignon from a vineyard I'd never heard of, but that was presumably expensive enough to make a statement. She poured herself a generous glass and gestured toward me with the bottle. Emily? Sparkling water with lime, please, I told the server. Excellent choice. I'll get that right out for you. Have you had a chance to look at our menu? Tonight's special is pan-seared duck breast with cherry gastrique and roasted root vegetables. We'll need a few more minutes, Gabriella said, her smile bright and dismissive. When the server left, she leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting to something more intimate and conspiratorial. You look good, Em. Really good. I know the last few months have been hard on you with Dad and everything, but you look like you're taking care of yourself. I'm managing, I said, unfolding my napkin and placing it in my lap. How's work? Oh, you know how it is. Busy season. Everyone wants to hit their numbers before the end of the year. I'm actually leading my district in sales right now, which is exciting but also exhausting. She took a sip of wine, her eyes never leaving my face. But enough about work. How are you doing? Really? The question felt loaded, weighted with implications I couldn't quite identify. I'm fine. Work is steady. I'm settling into the routine. And the house? Dad's house, I mean. That must be difficult being there with all the memories. I sold it, I said simply. Her wine glass paused halfway to her lips. You sold it? Already? The market was good. It made sense financially. But that was our childhood home. All our memories are there. My memories of the last 3 years are there too, I said quietly. It was time to move on. She set down her wine glass, her fingers drumming lightly against the stem. So you have the money now, the full amount. The estate has been settled, yes. $350,000 is a lot of money. It is. Enough to change someone's life. It could be. We ordered appetizers, calamari that neither of us would eat, chosen more for the ritual of ordering than any actual desire for food. The conversation continued in this careful dance, each of us probing for information while revealing as little as possible. Gabriella talked about her work, her apartment, her social life. She mentioned a new boyfriend, a pharmaceutical executive she'd met at a conference, and a promotion she was hoping to receive. She asked about my job, my apartment, my plans for the future. The conversation was pleasant, surface level, the kind of small talk that fills space without creating connection. But underneath the pleasantries, I could feel the tension building. This wasn't a social dinner. This was a negotiation, and we were still in the opening moves. 20 minutes into our meal, the restaurant's front door opened. The change in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations at nearby tables didn't stop, but they quieted. The easy laughter and clinking of silverware continued, but there was a new undercurrent of awareness, the way a forest goes quiet when a predator enters. A man walked in. He was tall, easily 6'4", with the kind of broad shoulders that suggested either genetics or serious time in a gym. His dark leather jacket fit him perfectly, tailored to accommodate his frame without looking oversized. His jeans were dark and well-fitted. His boots were expensive and well-maintained, but it wasn't his clothing that commanded attention. It was his presence. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. His eyes swept the restaurant with practiced efficiency, cataloging exits, identifying potential threats, assessing the environment with the kind of automatic awareness that comes from years of experience in situations where such assessments matter. Those eyes found Gabriella, and he began walking directly toward our table. "Gabriella," he said when he reached us. His voice was low, rough, with an accent I couldn't immediately place. Eastern, European perhaps, or Russian. "Victor," she replied, and I heard something in her voice I'd never heard before, nervousness. Real nervousness, not the performative anxiety she deployed when she wanted sympathy. She gestured toward me with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "This is my sister, Emily." Victor looked down at me. It wasn't a casual glance or a polite acknowledgement. It was an assessment, cold, professional, and thorough. He was evaluating me the way a mechanic evaluates a car, looking for weaknesses, strengths, and potential problems. "Nice to meet you," I said, my voice steady despite the alarm bells now ringing at full volume in my head. "Likewise," he replied, though his tone suggested that meeting me was a necessary unpleasantness rather than a pleasure. Without being invited, he pulled out the empty chair at our table and sat down. The movement was smooth and deliberate, claiming space and establishing dominance through the simple act of making himself at home in our conversation. The server appeared almost immediately, drawn by some service industry instinct that told him the dynamics at our table had shifted. "Can I get you anything, sir?" "Whiskey," Victor said without looking at him. "Whatever you have that's not bottom shelf. We have a nice selection of single malts." "Just bring me something that doesn't taste like paint thinner," Victor interrupted. The server nodded and retreated, clearly uncomfortable with the new energy at our table. Gabriella shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence evaporating. "Victor is a friend of mine," she said, her voice pitched higher than normal. "I thought it might be helpful to have a neutral third party here, someone who could help us work through some of the complications with Dad's estate." I folded my hands on the table, intertwining my fingers to keep them steady. "Work through what complications? The estate isn't complicated. It's been settled by the probate court." "The distribution of assets," Gabriella said quickly. "I thought having someone objective present might help us find a solution that works for everyone." I looked at Victor again. Objective, neutral. The words were laughable. This man radiated menace the way a space heater radiated warmth. Everything about him, from his positioning at the table to his cold stare to the way he'd claimed space without permission, was designed to create discomfort and pressure. "I don't need a mediator," I said calmly, channeling every ounce of authority I'd developed through years of managing construction projects and dealing with difficult subcontractors. "There's nothing to mediate. Dad's will was clear, and it's been legally executed." Gabriella's smile tightened around the edges. "Emily, please don't be difficult about this. I'm trying to find a reasonable solution." "I'm not being difficult. I'm stating facts." Victor leaned back in his chair, his arms crossing over his chest. The leather of his jacket creaked softly. He didn't speak, but his presence was a message, an implication of consequences, a suggestion that cooperation might be in my best interests. But here's the thing about me that Gabriella had never understood. I don't intimidate easily. I had spent years on construction sites, dealing with union foremen who thought they could bully the little girl in the office. I had negotiated with suppliers who tried to pressure me into accepting substandard materials or inflated prices. I had managed projects where contractors attempted to intimidate me into approving change orders that would pad their profits at my company's expense. I knew how to hold my ground. I knew that bullies, almost without exception, were cowards looking for easy victories. And I knew that the moment you showed fear, you lost whatever leverage you might have had. I turned my full attention to Victor. "What exactly is your role here?" He didn't answer immediately. His jaw worked slightly, as if he were chewing on something unpalatable. His eyes remained fixed on mine, unblinking and cold. Gabriella jumped into the silence, desperate to maintain control of the narrative. "Victor is here to make sure we're all on the same page, that we can reach an understanding that feels fair to everyone." "And what page is that?" I asked. She reached into her purse, a designer bag that I now realized was probably a knockoff, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the table between us with the careful precision of someone playing a crucial card in a high-stakes game. "I just need you to sign this," she said. "It's a simple agreement. We split the house proceeds 50-50, fair and square." I didn't touch the paper. I didn't even look down at it. Fair would be following Dad's will, which left everything to me. "Emily, come on." Her voice took on a pleading quality, but there was steel underneath it. "You can't seriously think it's right for you to keep all of it. I'm his daughter, too. I have just as much right to that money as you do." "Then you should have visited him more than twice in 3 years." The words landed like a physical blow. Her face flushed red, then went pale, then settled into something cold and hard. Victor's expression didn't change, but I saw his eyes flicker. Interest, doubt. He was processing information, recalibrating his understanding of the situation. "Just sign the paper, Emily," Gabriella said, her voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous. "It's easier for everyone if you just cooperate." I leaned back in my chair, studying both of them. This was the moment of truth. This was where Gabriella's plan would succeed or fail. She had brought muscle to intimidate me into compliance. She had crafted a narrative where I was the unreasonable one, the greedy sister who needed to be convinced to do the right thing. But she had made one crucial miscalculation. She had assumed I was still the little sister who handed over money without question. She had assumed I was still the person who would bend rather than break, who would sacrifice my own interests to keep the peace. She had assumed wrong. "No," I said simply. The word hung in the air between us, final and absolute. Gabriella's eyes narrowed. Victor shifted forward, his bulk suddenly seeming more threatening. For the first time since he'd sat down, I felt a genuine flicker of physical unease. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that was meant only for me. "Just sign it, Emily. Don't make this harder than it has to be." And that's when I laughed. It wasn't a nervous giggle or a scared titter. It was a genuine, amused laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep in my chest. The sound seemed to surprise everyone at the table, including myself, because in that moment, looking at my desperate sister and her hired intimidator, I realized something that changed everything. I knew exactly who Victor worked for, and I had a date with his boss in 2 hours. The laughter seemed to hang in the air like smoke, drawing stares from nearby tables and causing Victor's eyes to narrow with something that might have been confusion or irritation. "Something funny?" he asked, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "Actually, yes," I said, settling back in my chair with a composure that surprised even me. "Let me ask you something, Victor. What exactly did my sister tell you about this situation?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She told me you were keeping money that should be split between you. And did she mention how that money came to be mine?" Gabriella's face had gone pale. "Emily, don't—" "Did she tell you about our father's 3-year illness?" I continued, ignoring her interruption. "Did she mention that I moved back from Denver to care for him full-time while she visited twice in 3 years?" Victor's gaze shifted to Gabriella, then back to me. I could see him processing this information, comparing it to whatever story she had fed him. "Did she tell you that our father was mentally competent when he signed his will 18 months ago, specifically stating that he was leaving everything to me because of my sacrifice and devotion?" I pressed on. "Or did she paint a different picture?" "Emily, stop," Gabriella hissed, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. "What did she promise you, Victor?" I asked directly. "A percentage of whatever she could squeeze out of me? A flat fee for showing up and looking intimidating?" His silence was answer enough. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, setting it deliberately on the table. "You know what? Let's call the estate attorney right now. Mr. Henderson can explain the legal situation to you directly. Would that help clarify things?" "That's not necessary," Gabriella said quickly, panic creeping into her voice. "Why not?" I asked innocently. "If your version of events is accurate, then having a lawyer confirm it should strengthen your position." She didn't answer. I looked back at Victor. "She lied to you, didn't she? Whatever sob story she told you to get you here, it wasn't the complete truth." His expression had shifted from cold assessment to something that looked distinctly like annoyance. Professional intimidators, I realized, Probably didn't appreciate being manipulated any more than anyone else did. "What did you tell me, Gabriella?" he asked, his voice carrying a new undertone of menace. But this time, it wasn't directed at me. "I told you the truth," she said desperately. "Emily is keeping money that should be shared. That is the truth." "No," I said firmly. "The truth is that our father made a deliberate choice to leave his estate to the daughter who cared for him during his final illness. The truth is that choice was legally documented and properly executed. The truth is that you're trying to use intimidation to force me to give you money you have no legal or moral claim to." The silence that followed was profound. Other diners continued their conversations, unaware of the drama playing out at our corner table. The server approached with Victor's whiskey, set it down quickly, and retreated without asking if we needed anything else. Victor picked up his glass and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving Gabriella's face. "You told me she stole from you." "She did. You told me there was no will, that your father died intestate." "I never said—" "You told me she was weak, that she'd fold if I just showed up and applied a little pressure." Gabriella's mouth opened and closed without sound. Victor stood abruptly, the movement sharp and decisive. "I'm done here." "Wait," Gabriella grabbed his arm. "Victor, please, we had a deal." "We had a deal based on information you misrepresented," he said, shaking off her grip with casual ease. "You lied to me. You wasted my time. And you involved me in a family dispute that's none of my business." "I'll pay you double," she said desperately. "Triple. Whatever you want. I just need her to sign this paper." He looked down at her with something approaching disgust. "You don't have the money to pay me anything. I checked your credit report before I agreed to this job. You're broke, Gabriella, maxed out on 5 credit cards and 3 months behind on your rent." Her face went white. "How do you—" "I don't take jobs from people without knowing whether they can pay," he said flatly. "You're in debt up to your eyeballs. Whatever you promised me, you can't deliver." He turned to leave, but paused and looked back at me. "For what it's worth, you handled this better than most people would have." "Thank you," I said. "And Gabriella?" He looked down at my sister, who was now slumped in her chair like a deflated balloon. "Don't call me again, ever." He walked away, weaving through the tables with the same fluid confidence he'd shown when he arrived. The restaurant's atmosphere seemed to lighten as he left, conversations resuming their normal volume, the tension dissipating like smoke. Gabriella sat in stunned silence, staring at the space where Victor had been. Her carefully constructed plan had collapsed in less than 30 minutes, and she clearly hadn't prepared for this outcome. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, letting the moment settle. "Well," I said finally, "that was educational." She whipped her head around to glare at me, tears of rage and frustration beginning to form in her eyes. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've won." "I think I've stated the facts clearly," I said calmly. "Nothing more, nothing less." "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm not giving up. I'll find another way." "No," I said, my voice carrying a finality that surprised both of us. "You won't, because there is no other way. The will is legal, the estate is settled, the money is mine, and no amount of scheming or intimidation or emotional manipulation is going to change that." She slammed her hand on the table, causing silverware to rattle and drawing stares from nearby diners. "You're going to regret this, Emily. You're going to regret cutting me out of your life." "I'm not cutting you out," I said quietly. "You cut yourself out the moment you brought a stranger here to threaten me. You cut yourself out when you chose manipulation over honesty. You cut yourself out when you decided that intimidation was preferable to having an actual conversation about our father's death and what it means for our family." I stood up, pulling my purse over my shoulder. "The bill is yours. Consider it a small price to pay for the education you just received." I walked away, leaving her sitting alone at the table with her untouched wine and her failed scheme. Outside the restaurant, the October air was crisp and clean. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting my heart rate return to normal and processing what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Alexander, still on for drinks tonight? The bell tower at 9?" I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely, I have quite a story to tell you." As I walked to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine freedom. Not just from Gabriella's harassment, but from the weight of family obligation that had been pressing down on me since Dad's death. I had stood my ground. I had refused to be intimidated. I had protected what was rightfully mine. And I was about to have a very interesting conversation with the man who, unbeknownst to my sister, had been the real power behind Victor's sudden change of heart. The bell tower occupied the top floor of a converted Art Deco building in downtown Tulsa, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city's modest skyline. The interior was all clean lines and subtle luxury, leather banquettes, marble-top tables, and a bar that stretched along one entire wall like a piece of functional art. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly from habit and partly because I needed time to decompress from the dinner confrontation. The hostess, an elegant woman in her 30s with silver hair and perfect posture, led me to a corner table where I could see both the entrance and the city lights beginning to twinkle in the darkness below. Alexander was already there. He stood as I approached, his smile warm and genuine in a way that made the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, the kind of tailoring that spoke of both success and attention to detail. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his eyes, a deep brown that seemed to see everything, held mine as he pulled out my chair. "Emily," he said, his accent adding a slight musical quality to my name. "You look beautiful, but you also look like you've had an interesting evening." "That's one way to put it," I said, settling into my seat. A server appeared almost immediately, the kind of attentive service that came with the bell tower's reputation and price point. Alexander ordered his usual whiskey, neat. I asked for a glass of red wine, something substantial enough to match the weight of the conversation I was about to have. "So," Alexander said once we were alone, "tell me about this interesting evening." I told him everything. The dinner invitation, Gabriella's performance of sisterly contrition, the arrival of Victor and his obvious role as hired intimidation, the confrontation and its aftermath. Alexander listened without interruption, his expression shifting subtly as I described each element of the evening. When I mentioned Victor by name, his eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. When I described the man's physical appearance and demeanor, his jaw tightened just enough to be noticeable. "Tall," he said when I finished. "Broad shoulders, leather jacket, scar along his left jawline." "That's him," I confirmed. Alexander set his whiskey glass down with deliberate care. "Victor Kozlov works for me." "I know," I said simply. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Do you?" "You mentioned him 3 weeks ago, when we were talking about your business and some of the challenges you face with personnel management. You said some of your employees could be overzealous, and you described someone who matched Victor's description exactly." A slow smile spread across Alexander's face. "You pay attention?" "It's my job," I said, "and my survival strategy." "Did he threaten you directly?" "No, he mostly just sat there and radiated menace. But the implication was clear. Gabriella brought him to scare me into signing away half my inheritance." Alexander's expression went cold in a way I'd never seen before. The charming, sophisticated man I'd been getting to know vanished, replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. "That's unacceptable," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made me understand why Victor had looked genuinely frightened when I'd mentioned Alexander's name. "I handled it," I said quickly. "Once I called his bluff and exposed Gabriella's lies, he left. But Alexander, what kind of business are you really in?" He was quiet for a long moment. studying my face as if trying to determine how much truth I could handle. "I provide security services," he said finally, "for clients who need protection that goes beyond what conventional security companies can offer." "And Victor?" "Victor handles collections, debt recovery, situations where standard legal remedies have proven insufficient." I nodded slowly, processing this information. So when my sister hired him to intimidate me, she hired someone who works for the man you're dating, someone who, had he known about our relationship, would never have taken the job. "What happens now?" Alexander pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. "Victor will be reassigned to less client-facing work permanently, and he'll be having a conversation with his supervisor about the importance of clearing outside employment before accepting it." "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "He crossed a line. He threatened someone under my protection. That's not something I tolerate." Under my protection. The phrase sent a complex mix of emotions through me. Gratitude, certainly, but also a sense of power I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being pushed around. I wasn't the one scrambling to defend myself against someone else's agenda. "What about Gabriella?" I asked. "What about her? She's desperate. She mentioned owing money to dangerous people. If Victor won't help her, she might try to find someone else." Alexander's smile was sharp and cold. "Let her try. Word travels fast in certain circles. By tomorrow morning, everyone who might be interested in taking her money will know that Emily Vance is off limits." "Off limits?" "Under my protection," he repeated. "Anyone who threatens you threatens me. That's a message most professionals in this city understand very clearly." We talked for another hour about lighter topics: his business travels, my work projects, plans for the upcoming weekend. But underneath the surface conversation, I could feel the fundamental shift in our dynamic. I wasn't just Emily anymore, the quiet logistics coordinator who'd inherited some money from her father. I was Emily Vance, the woman who'd stood up to intimidation and won, who'd outmaneuvered her manipulative sister, who'd found herself under the protection of someone with real power. When Alexander walked me to my car at the end of the evening, he kissed me softly and said, "If your sister contacts you again, in any way, you call me immediately." "I will," I said, and meant it. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Tulsa, I realized that everything had changed. Not just my relationship with Gabriella, which was probably beyond repair, but my understanding of my own strength and capabilities. I had faced down a professional intimidator and won. I had exposed my sister's lies and manipulation. I had protected what was rightfully mine. And I had done it all without backing down, without compromising, without giving in to the pressure that had defined so much of my relationship with my family. For the first time in my life, I felt truly powerful. The next morning brought 17 missed calls and 34 text messages from Gabriella, a digital barrage that began at 3:47 a.m. and continued until nearly dawn. The messages ran the full spectrum of human emotion: rage, desperation, bargaining, threats, and finally, a kind of hollow acceptance. "You think you're so smart. This isn't over. You'll regret this. Please, Emily, I'm begging you. I'm your sister. How can you do this to family? I'm in real trouble. They're going to hurt me. Fine, you win. I hope you're happy." I deleted them all without responding, then blocked her number. The silence that followed felt like stepping out of a noisy room into fresh air. At Driftline Construction, I threw myself into work with renewed focus. We were in the middle of coordinating a complex commercial project, a mixed-use development that required precise timing of deliveries, subcontractor schedules, and municipal inspections. It was the kind of logistical puzzle I'd always enjoyed, but now I found myself approaching it with increased confidence and authority. When a concrete supplier tried to push back a delivery date that would have thrown our entire timeline off schedule, I didn't negotiate or plead. I simply informed them that failure to meet their contractual obligations would result in immediate termination of our business relationship and a formal complaint to the Better Business Bureau. The concrete arrived on time. When a union foreman tried to pressure me into approving overtime hours that weren't justified by the work completed, I didn't cave to avoid conflict. I presented him with detailed documentation of actual progress versus projected timelines and made it clear that any attempts to pad hours would be reported to his supervisor. The overtime request was withdrawn. My boss, Walter, noticed the change during our weekly project review meeting. "You seem different lately," he observed, looking up from the spreadsheets I'd prepared. "More assertive. It's a good look on you." "I've had some practice recently," I said. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. The clients have been impressed with your project management. Henderson from Riverside Development specifically asked if you'd be available to coordinate their next phase." That afternoon, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Emily, this is Victor." I straightened in my chair. "Victor, I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine regret I hadn't heard the night before. "For last night, I didn't know the full situation. Your sister, she misrepresented things. She did. I also wanted you to know that she's been calling me since last night, offering me more money, making promises. I told her to lose my number." "Good. Mr. Volkov made it very clear that you're not to be bothered by anyone, ever. I wanted you to hear that directly from me." "I appreciate that, Victor. For what it's worth, you handled yourself well last night. Better than most people would have." After he hung up, I sat for a moment thinking about the conversation. 6 months ago, I would have been terrified by the idea of having any connection to Alexander's world. Now I found myself grateful for the protection it offered. That evening, I met Alexander for dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant on the south side of town. He was already seated when I arrived, reading something on his phone with the focused attention he brought to everything he did. "How was your day?" he asked after we'd ordered. "Productive and quiet. No calls from Gabriella." "There won't be any more calls from Gabriella," he said with certainty. "How can you be sure?" "Because I had a conversation with the people she owes money to. Her debts have been resolved." I set down my wine glass. "Alexander, what did you do?" "I bought her debt," he said simply, "from a small-time bookie who was getting impatient about repayment. Now she owes me instead of him, and I've forgiven the debt with one condition. She leaves Tulsa, permanently. She finds a job in another city, starts a new life, and never contacts you again." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. "You paid off her gambling debts?" "I solved a problem," he corrected. "Your problem. She was desperate enough to hire muscle to intimidate you. Desperate people make poor decisions. I removed the desperation." "How much did she owe?" "Enough to motivate her relocation, but not enough to significantly impact my business operations." "Alexander." "Emily," he said, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. "You're important to me. More important than you probably realize. I don't like people who threaten what's mine." "What's mine?" The possessiveness in his voice should have been concerning, but instead it felt like security, like protection, like belonging to something larger and more powerful than myself. "What happens if she doesn't leave?" "She'll leave," he said with quiet confidence. "I made the terms of our agreement very clear." 3 days later, I learned through a mutual acquaintance that Gabriella had indeed left Tulsa. She'd quit her job at Morrison Pharmaceuticals, broken her apartment lease, and moved to Seattle, where she'd apparently found work with a smaller pharmaceutical company. The harassment stopped completely. No more calls, no more texts, no more relatives calling to pressure me about doing the right thing. For the first time since Dad's death, I could breathe. With the Gabriella situation resolved, I found myself with the mental and emotional space to actually think about my future. The inheritance money sat in my savings account like a seed waiting to be planted. I could pay off my student loans, which would free up several $100s a month in payments. I could invest in the stock market, building long-term wealth. I could travel, seeing the places Dad had always talked about visiting but never had the chance to explore. Or I could take a bigger risk. The idea had been percolating in the back of my mind for months, ever since Walter had started giving me more complex projects and greater autonomy. What if I started my own logistics consulting firm? What if I took the skills I'd developed at Driftline and applied them to a broader range of clients? I mentioned the idea to Alexander during one of our regular dinners. "Tell me more," he said, setting down his fork and giving me his complete attention. "Construction companies aren't the only businesses that need logistics coordination," I explained. "Any company that deals with complex supply chains, multiple vendors, tight deadlines, they all face the same challenges I solve every day at Driftline." "What would you need to get started?" "Office space, basic equipment, insurance, marketing materials, probably about $50,000 in startup costs to do it right." "And clients?" "I have some ideas. Companies I've worked with as suppliers who've mentioned they could use better coordination. A few contractors who've talked about expanding but don't have the internal expertise to manage larger projects." Alexander nodded slowly. "It's a good idea. You have the skills, the experience, and the network. The question is whether you have the appetite for the risk." "What do you mean?" "Starting your own business means giving up the security of a steady paycheck. It means being responsible for finding your own clients, managing your own cash flow, dealing with all the administrative details that someone else handles for you now." I thought about that for a moment. 6 months ago, the idea of giving up job security would have terrified me. But facing down Victor in that restaurant had changed something fundamental about my relationship with risk. "I think I do," I said finally. "Have the appetite for it, I mean." "Then you should do it." "Just like that?" "Just like that. You have the money to fund it properly. You have the skills to make it successful. And you have me to provide advice and connections when you need them." That last point was significant. Alexander's business network was extensive and international. A recommendation from him could open doors that might otherwise remain closed to a new consultant. Within 2 weeks, I had found office space, a small suite in a converted warehouse not far from downtown, with exposed brick walls and large windows that flooded the space with natural light. I hired a lawyer to handle the incorporation paperwork and an accountant to set up the financial systems. I designed business cards and a website, invested in quality furniture and equipment, and created marketing materials that positioned Emily Vance Logistics as a boutique firm specializing in complex project coordination. My first client was Henderson Development, the company Walter had mentioned. They were planning a mixed-use project that would require coordination between multiple contractors, city planning departments, and utility companies. It was exactly the kind of complex challenge I'd been handling at Driftline, but now I was doing it as the owner of my own company. The project was successful enough that Henderson recommended me to 2 other development companies. Within 6 months, I had a steady client base and was earning more than I'd ever made as an employee. More importantly, I was building something that was entirely mine. Every decision, every client relationship, every success or failure belonged to me. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Alexander was supportive throughout the process, offering advice when I asked for it, but never trying to take control or make decisions for me. He understood that this was my venture, my chance to prove to myself that I could succeed on my own terms. One evening, as we sat in my new office after hours, looking out at the city lights, he asked me a question that had been on my mind as well. "Do you ever think about Gabriella?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "I wonder if she's actually building a new life in Seattle, or if she's just looking for her next angle." "Does it matter?" I considered that. "No, I don't think it does. She made her choices. I made mine. Whatever happens with her life from here is her responsibility." Do you miss her? I miss the idea of having a sister, I said carefully. I miss the relationship I always hoped we might have someday. But I don't miss the person she actually was. The manipulation, the drama, the constant pressure to give her things she hadn't earned. That's a healthy perspective. It took me a long time to get here, I said. For years, I felt guilty about not being closer to her. I thought there was something wrong with me for not wanting to help her more, for not being more forgiving of her behavior. And now I understand that some relationships are toxic regardless of biology. That family doesn't automatically entitle someone to unlimited chances or unconditional support. That protecting yourself from people who hurt you isn't selfish, it's necessary. Alexander reached over and took my hand. Your father would be proud of you. I hope so. I know so. You took care of him when he needed it most. You honored his final wishes even when it was difficult. You built something positive from the inheritance he left you. That's exactly what he would have wanted. 2 years after that confrontation at Rustic Table, I stood in the conference room of Emily Vance Logistics, looking out at downtown Tulsa while my team prepared for a client presentation. The business had grown beyond my initial expectations. We now had 8 employees and contracts with companies across 3 states. The conference room itself was a point of pride. The table was made from reclaimed wood, similar to the tables at Rustic Table, but chosen for its beauty rather than its intimidation factor. The walls were lined with project photos and client testimonials. Everything about the space reflected competence, success, and stability. My assistant knocked on the door. Emily, there's a call for you on line 2. She says she's your sister. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, but it was manageable now, controlled. I'll take it, I said. I picked up the phone in my private office, closing the door behind me. Hello, Gabriella. Emily. Her voice was different, smaller, less confident than I remembered. I hope it's okay that I called. I got your number from your website. What do you want? I wanted to congratulate you on your business. I've been following your company online, and it looks like you're doing really well. Thank you. I also wanted to apologize, again, for everything that happened. The restaurant, the pressure about the inheritance, all of it. I was in a bad place and I made terrible decisions. I waited, saying nothing. I'm doing better now, she continued. I'm in therapy. I'm working for a good company. I'm trying to be different, better. I'm glad to hear that. I was wondering, I know this is probably too much to ask, but I was wondering if there might be a chance for us to have some kind of relationship again. Not like before, but maybe something. I looked out my office window at the city where I'd built my new life, where I'd learned to stand up for myself, where I'd discovered my own strength. No, I said quietly but firmly. I don't think there is. Silence. I understand, she said finally. I had to ask. Gabriella, I hope your therapy helps. I hope you build a good life in Seattle. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but I can't be part of that process. Too much happened. Too much trust was broken. I know. I miss having a sister. You had a sister, I said. You chose to treat her as an ATM instead. That was your decision, and these are the consequences. After I hung up, I sat for a moment processing the conversation. 2 years ago, that call would have sent me into an emotional spiral. I would have spent days analyzing every word, wondering if I was being too harsh, feeling guilty about maintaining boundaries. Now I felt nothing but a quiet certainty that I had made the right choice. There was a soft knock on my door. Alexander entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop downstairs. Everything okay? He asked, handing me one of the cups. Gabriella called. His expression sharpened slightly. What did she want? To apologize, to see if there was a chance for reconciliation. And? I told her no. He smiled, the expression warm and proud. Good. She sounded different, like she might actually be working on herself. That's good for her, but it doesn't obligate you to anything. I know, it's just, part of me wonders if I should give her another chance. Alexander set down his coffee and moved to stand behind my chair, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. Emily, you've built an incredible life. You have a successful business, people who respect you, a future full of possibilities. You did all of that by learning to protect yourself from people who would take advantage of you. Don't second-guess that now. You're right. Besides, he added with a slight smile, we have more important things to think about. Such as? He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My breath caught. Such as whether you'd like to make our partnership official, he said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant diamond ring. I stared at the ring, then up at his face, seeing nothing but love and certainty in his expression. Alexander. I know it's not traditional to propose in your office, he said, but this is where you built your independence, where you proved to yourself that you could succeed on your own terms. I wanted to ask you here, in the place that represents your strength. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, my father's death, the inheritance battle, the confrontation with Gabriella and Victor, the gradual building of my business and my confidence, the relationship with Alexander that had grown from attraction to partnership to something deeper and more meaningful. Yes, I said simply. He slipped the ring onto my finger and it fit perfectly. I love you, he said. I love you too. As he kissed me, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window, a successful businesswoman in her own office, wearing an engagement ring from a man who valued her strength rather than trying to diminish it. I looked nothing like the woman who had sat in that restaurant 2 years ago, intimidated by her sister's schemes and uncertain of her own power. That woman had been afraid of conflict, afraid of standing up for herself, afraid of disappointing people who didn't deserve her consideration. This woman was afraid of nothing. 5 years after my father's death, I stood in the penthouse apartment I shared with Alexander, looking out at the Tulsa skyline as it glittered in the evening light. Emily Vance Logistics had grown into a regional powerhouse with offices in 3 cities and a client list that included some of the largest development companies in the Southwest. The inheritance money that had started it all was long since invested and reinvested, transformed from a lump sum into a diversified portfolio that provided both security and growth. But more than that, it had been the seed capital for something larger. A life built on my own terms, free from the manipulation and drama that had defined my relationship with my family for so long. I rarely thought about Gabriella anymore. Occasionally, I would hear updates through mutual acquaintances. She was still in Seattle, still working in pharmaceutical sales, apparently living a quiet, stable life. I was glad for her, in an abstract way, but she felt like a character from a book I'd read long ago, rather than someone who had once been central to my world. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Alexander's voice came through the intercom. "Emily, there's someone here to see you." "Who is it?" "Says his name is Victor. Says he has something that belongs to you." I frowned, curiosity overriding caution. "Send him up." A few minutes later, Victor Kozlov stood in my living room, looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered. He was dressed in a simple business suit rather than the leather jacket that had been his uniform, and his demeanor was respectful rather than threatening. "Ms. Vance?" he said, offering a slight nod. "Thank you for seeing me." "Victor, it's been a long time." 5 years, he agreed. "I wanted to return this to you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the same document Gabriella had tried to force me to sign that night at Rustic Table. "I kept it," he said, offering it to me, as a reminder. A reminder of what? That I should never take a job without understanding the full situation, that family disputes are messy and complicated, that people lie, especially when they're desperate. I took the paper, unfolding it to see Gabriella's handwriting and the vague, legally meaningless language she'd hoped would trick me into signing away half my inheritance. "Why bring this to me now?" I asked. "Because I wanted you to know that I learned something from that night, about respect, about integrity, about the difference between intimidation and actual strength." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You could have had Mr. Volkov destroy me after what happened. You could have made sure I never worked again. Instead, you let me learn from my mistake and move on. That meant something to me." "What are you doing now?" "I work for a private security firm. Legitimate work. Background checks, personal protection, corporate security consulting. It's better than what I was doing before." "I'm glad to hear that." "I also wanted you to know that your sister tried to contact me about 6 months ago. She's apparently doing well in Seattle, but she asked if I thought there was any way to repair the relationship with you." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, that she made her choices and you made yours, that the best thing she could do was leave you alone and focus on building a better life for herself." I nodded, appreciating his honesty. "She seemed to understand," he continued. "I don't think she'll bother you again." After Victor left, I sat with the document in my hands, thinking about the journey it represented. This piece of paper had been Gabriella's last desperate attempt to claim something that had never belonged to her. It had been the focal point of a confrontation that changed the trajectory of my life. Now it was just a curiosity, an artifact from a time when I had been someone else entirely. I walked over to the fireplace and tossed the paper into the flames, watching it curl and blacken and disappear into ash. Alexander appeared beside me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Burning bridges?" he asked with amusement. "Burning the past," I corrected, "making room for the future." "Any regrets?" I thought about that question, really thought about it. Did I regret the loss of my relationship with Gabriella? Did I regret the hardness I'd had to develop to protect myself? Did I regret the choices that had led me away from the conventional path of family forgiveness and towards something more complicated, but ultimately more honest? "No," I said finally. "No regrets at all." Outside our windows, the city lights stretched toward the horizon, each one representing someone's dreams, someone's struggles, someone's determination to build something meaningful from whatever materials life had given them. I had built my life from loss and conflict, from inheritance money and hard-won wisdom, from the ashes of family relationships that had never been as healthy as I'd pretended they were. I had built it strong. I had built it on my own terms. And I had built it to last. That was enough. That was everything.